Your last name might be evidence of something the United States government tried to erase, not a rumor, not a legend passed around at family dinners. An actual historical fact, buried inside a set of government ledgers so powerful that they still determine legal identity, tribal citizenship, and land rights in America right now in the 21st century. Millions of Americans carry surnames that appear on documents that change the course of a nation, and most of them have absolutely no idea. The name you sign on every document, every check, every form, it might be a doorway into one of the most extraordinary and heartbreaking stories in all of American history. Let's open that door. There is a set of documents sitting inside the National Archives of the United States that most Americans have never heard of, never searched, and never thought to look for. They are not classified. They are not hidden. They have been sitting there, open to the public, for over a century. And yet, what is recorded inside those pages has the power to completely change how you understand your own family, your own blood, and your own place in the story of this country. These documents are called the Dawes Rolls. And if your surname appears on them, everything you thought you knew about where you come from is about to be rewritten. Let's go back. Back before Oklahoma was a state. Back before Indian Territory was divided and distributed to settlers hungry for land. Back to a period in American history that most school curricula touch lightly, briefly, almost apologetically, as if the truth is too heavy to carry into a classroom. The Cherokee Nation in the early 19th century was not a collection of nomadic tribespeople living in temporary settlements. They were a sovereign civilization. They had a written language created by the brilliant Sequoyah, a man who developed an entire syllabary, a complete writing system, on his own without any formal education, arguably one of the most remarkable intellectual achievements in the history of the Western Hemisphere. They had a newspaper, the Cherokee Phoenix, printed in both English and Cherokee. They had a constitution, modeled partly on the American one. They had schools, churches, farms, and roads. They were, by the standards of the era, a functioning and sophisticated nation within a nation. And that, as it turned out, was the problem. Think about what that means. The more civilized the Cherokee became by American standards, the more valuable their land appeared to American eyes. Gold was discovered in Georgia on Cherokee territory in 1829. White settlers were already pushing at the borders. Cotton was king, and the soil of the Cherokee homeland was fertile and wide. There was a word for what was about to happen, but the American government of the time preferred a different one. They called it removal. History calls it something closer to catastrophe. President Andrew Jackson signed the Indian Removal Act in 1830. It was a law that authorized the federal government to forcibly relocate Native American tribes east of the Mississippi River to lands west of it. The Cherokee fought it in court. They took their case all the way to the United States Supreme Court. In Worcester v. Georgia in 1832, Chief Justice John Marshall ruled in their favor. The federal government had no authority over Cherokee lands. It was a legal victory that should have protected them. But President Jackson reportedly dismissed the ruling entirely. The court had made its decision, and he chose not to enforce it. And this is where everything changes, because what followed was not a legal process. It was not a policy disagreement. What followed was a military operation. In May of 1838, more than 7,000 federal troops and state militia under the command of General Winfield Scott swept through Cherokee territory in Georgia, Tennessee, Alabama, and North Carolina. They surrounded homes. They arrested men working in their fields. They dragged women out of their houses in languages they did not understand. Children were separated from their parents. Within weeks, approximately 17,000 Cherokee people were confined inside wooden stockades and internment camps in the sweltering summer heat. Crowding, poor sanitation, and disease began killing people before the march had even begun. Thousands died before they ever took a single step westward. Read that again. They were dying before the march even started. Then, beginning in the fall of 1838, groups of roughly 1,000 Cherokee at a time were force-marched westward toward what is now Oklahoma, then known as Indian Territory. They walked through 9 states. They walked through autumn rains that turned roads into rivers of mud. They walked through the brutal winter of 1838 and 1839. Many of them without adequate shoes, without enough food, without shelter against the cold. 2/3 of the Cherokee were trapped at times between the ice-bound Ohio and Mississippi rivers, with nowhere to go and nothing to eat. People drank stagnant water. Disease spread through the columns. The elderly and the very young died in the greatest numbers. Missionary Dr. Elizur Butler, who accompanied the Cherokee on the march, estimated that over 4,000 people perished during the removal. Some estimates placed the death toll even higher, 1 in 5, perhaps 1 in 4, gone. Not on a battlefield, not in a declared war, on a government-mandated walk through their own country. The Cherokee called it Nunadal Tsuni, the trail where they cried, the trail of tears. But here is what the history books often gloss over. The Cherokee did not disappear. They did not dissolve into the landscape of American mythology and stop existing. They survived. They rebuilt. In Indian Territory, against extraordinary odds, they reconstructed their government, their schools, their courts, their society. The Cherokee Nation rose again from the mud of that forced march and became, once more, a functioning civilization. And that survival, that extraordinary defiant, against all logic survival, is exactly what made them a target again 60 years later. By the 1890s, the United States government had a new problem. The 5 civilized tribes on Guaymas, the Cherokee, the Choctaw, the Chickasaw, the Creek, and the Seminole, held millions of acres of land in Indian Territory communally as tribal nations. That land was not individually owned. It could not be sold. It could not be homesteaded by settlers. And the pressure from those settlers, from railroad companies, from land speculators, from politicians with connections to both, was becoming impossible to ignore. The solution the federal government arrived at was, in its own way, as devastating as the Trail of Tears had been, just slower, more bureaucratic, more wrapped in the language of fairness and progress. Congress authorized the Dawes Commission in 1893. Named after Senator Henry L. Dawes of Massachusetts, the commission was tasked with doing one thing: convincing the 5 civilized tribes to agree to a plan that would break up their communal lands and distribute them to individual tribal members as private allotments. The idea, sold publicly as a form of equality and modernization, was in reality a legal mechanism to open up the remaining tribal lands to non-native settlement and development. But before the land could be divided, there needed to be a list, a definitive, government-sanctioned, legally binding list of exactly who was and was not a member of each tribe. Between 1898 and 1907, with some additions made as late as 1914, the Dawes Commission traveled through Indian Territory and recorded the names, ages, family relationships, blood quantum, and roll numbers of every person it determined to be a legitimate citizen of the 5 civilized tribes. The Cherokee portion of the Dawes rolls contained multiple categories. There were the Cherokees by blood, those recognized as having Cherokee ancestry. There were the Delaware and Shawnee who had been formally adopted into the Cherokee Nation. And there were the freedmen, the formerly enslaved black people who had been owned by some Cherokee families and who, by treaty obligations following the Civil War, had been adopted into the nation as citizens. Each category was listed separately, each person assigned a number, each family grouped on a card. The commission recorded not just names, but also noted previous tribal census appearances, family connections, and in some cases, cross-references to other enrollment documents going back decades. But here is what most people do not know, and this is where the real story begins. The Dawes Commission was not a neutral genealogical exercise. It was a gatekeeping operation. The commission was flooded with applicants, tens of thousands of people from across the country claiming Cherokee ancestry, some legitimate, many not, all hoping to secure a land allotment. The commission had to reject the majority of them, and the criteria for rejection were often arbitrary, inconsistently applied, and in many cases, designed to minimize the number of people who qualified rather than maximize accurate enrollment. An enrollee had to prove they had been physically residing in Indian Territory before a certain date. If your ancestor had left and returned, or had lived on the edges of the territory, or had simply not been present when enumerators came through, they might be excluded entirely. The 1896 applications, the first attempt at enrollment, were eventually declared null and void altogether. Thousands of legitimate Cherokee people were left off the rolls through no fault of their own, their descendants forever cut off from legal recognition. Think about what that means for the millions of Americans today who believe they have Cherokee ancestry. Some of them are right. Some of them have family stories that are entirely accurate, traceable back to real people who lived in real Cherokee communities. But because of how the Dawes Rolls were constructed, because of the political pressures, the bureaucratic chaos, the deliberate exclusions, those real people may simply not appear on the list. And without that appearance, under the current laws of the Cherokee Nation, there is no path to tribal citizenship. The rolls were closed in 1907. They cannot be amended. The gate was shut more than a century ago, and it has not opened since. This is not chaos. This is consequence. And the consequences are still playing out right now. The Cherokee Nation of Oklahoma today is the largest federally recognized tribe in the United States by enrollment numbers, having surpassed 450,000 enrolled tribal citizens. That number is extraordinary. It is a testament to the survival and growth of a people who were nearly destroyed. But to be part of that number, to hold a certificate of degree of Indian blood, to be recognized as a Cherokee Nation citizen, an applicant must trace their lineage directly to a specific person who appears on the Dawes final rolls with a Cherokee blood quantum listed. Not a family story, not an oral tradition, not a photograph of a great-great-grandmother with high cheekbones and dark braids, a name, a number, a card in a ledger compiled between 1898 and 1914. And this is where the surnames come in. because those ledgers contain names, thousands of them, and within those thousands, certain surnames appear repeatedly, clustering across families and generations, marking the bloodlines of some of the most historically significant people in the entire Cherokee story. If your surname is among them, you may be holding, without knowing it, the first thread of a genealogical trail that leads back through those ledgers to the nation that survived the Trail of Tears. The name Ross carries perhaps the heaviest history of any surname on the rolls. John Ross was the principal chief of the Cherokee Nation during the Trail of Tears, a man of Scottish and Cherokee heritage who fought removal with every legal tool available to him, who watched his people die on that march, whose own wife, Quady, reportedly gave her blanket to a sick child during the crossing of the icy Arkansas River and died of pneumonia shortly afterward. Ross led the Cherokee Nation for decades, rebuilding it in Indian Territory, holding it together through the Civil War when the nation itself split between Confederate and Union loyalties. The Ross name on the Dawes Rolls carries the weight of that entire history. Descendants of that lineage are still traceable, still enrollable, still part of a living nation. The name Van tells a different kind of story. James Van was one of the wealthiest men in the Cherokee Nation in the early 19th century, a powerful mixed heritage trader who built a mansion, still standing today in Chatsworth, Georgia, one of the finest examples of federal-style architecture in the entire Southeast, that demonstrated just how thoroughly some Cherokee families had adopted and adapted to European material culture. The Van family was prominent, wealthy, and complicated. Their story involves both the heights of Cherokee political power and the brutal realities of enslaved labor on Cherokee plantations. The Van name appears across the Dawes Rolls in multiple categories, a single surname carrying within it the full, unresolved complexity of Cherokee history. The surname Adair traces back to Scottish traders who came into Cherokee country in the 18th century and married into the nation. John Adair, the historical figure associated with this name's entry into Cherokee genealogy, wrote one of the earliest detailed accounts of Cherokee culture in existence. The Adairs who appear on the Cherokee Rolls generations later were as much Cherokee as they were anything else, their identities shaped by a nation, a language, a set of clans and ceremonies that no European surname could fully contain. Then there is Sixkiller. If any Cherokee surname sounds like it belongs in a different kind of story entirely, it is this one. And yet, the origin of Sixkiller is not what most people imagine. The name is a translation into English of the Cherokee war name Sutalidihi, a name composed of the Cherokee word for six and the suffix meaning killer, originally a sacred ceremonial name connected to the sun. It became an English surname during the era when Cherokee people were required to adopt fixed surnames for government record-keeping purposes. The Sixkiller name appears dozens of times across the Dawes Rolls, a family deeply embedded in Cherokee life, whose name, in its English translation, sounds almost fictional but is entirely historically real. Ward connects directly to Nancy Ward, known in Cherokee as Nanyehi, one of the most remarkable figures in the entire history of the nation. Nancy Ward was a beloved woman, Gigao, a title given to women of extraordinary wisdom and influence in Cherokee society, one that granted them the right to speak in tribal councils and make decisions about the fate of captives. She was a peacemaker at a time when war was constant, a diplomat who tried repeatedly to bridge the worlds of Cherokee and American culture, a woman whose life spanned one of the most turbulent periods in her nation's history. The Ward name on the Cherokee Rolls carries that legacy forward through every generation it touched. Boudinot is a name that carries perhaps the most painful internal contradiction in all of Cherokee history. Elias Boudinot, born Galagina Uwati, Bukwate, was one of the most educated and publicly prominent Cherokee figures of his era. He founded the Cherokee Phoenix, the first Native American newspaper, printed in both English and the Cherokee syllabary. He was brilliant, cosmopolitan, and tragic, because it was Elias Boudinot, along with a small faction known as the Treaty Party, who signed the Treaty of New Echeta in 1835, the agreement that ceded all remaining Cherokee lands in the east in exchange for territory in the west. The vast majority of the Cherokee Nation had not authorized this treaty. John Ross and the National Party opposed it furiously, but the United States government accepted it anyway, and it became the legal justification for the Trail of Tears. Boudinot was assassinated in Indian Territory in 1839, killed by members of his own nation who viewed him as a traitor. His name appears in the Cherokee genealogical record as a marker of one of history's most complicated moral failures. Bushyhead connects to Dennis Wolfe Bushyhead, who served as principal chief of the Cherokee Nation in the late 19th century, a figure who navigated the Cherokee Nation through the era of the Dawes Commission itself. The name, distinctive and immediately recognizable, refers according to linguistic sources to a personal characteristic, bushy hair, that became attached to an ancestor and traveled forward through generations as a surname. Today, it is a name that signals unmistakably deep roots in Cherokee history. Ridge connects to Major Ridge, one of the most powerful Cherokee leaders of the early 19th century, a man who rose from warrior to statesman, who helped craft the Cherokee Constitution, and who ultimately joined the Treaty Party alongside Boudinot and signed away the eastern homeland. Like Boudinot, Major Ridge was assassinated in 1839. He and his son John Ridge killed on the same day as part of a coordinated retaliation for the new Echota Treaty. The Ridge name on the rolls carries that violence and that history in every syllable. Watty connects to Stand Watty, brother of Elias Boudinot, who became the only Native American to achieve the rank of general in the Confederate Army during the Civil War, and who was, notably, the last Confederate general to formally surrender, doing so on June 23, 1865, more than 2 months after the war had officially ended. The Cherokee Nation itself was divided during the Civil War, with the majority initially following Principal Chief John Ross in attempting neutrality before pressure from both sides made neutrality impossible. Stand Watty's story is one of the most unexpected threads in the entire tapestry of Cherokee history, a story that winds through the Trail of Tears, the Treaty Crisis, the Civil War, and the Dawes era in one unbroken line. Then there are names like Smith, Rogers, and Fields, European surnames so common across American society that millions of people carry them without ever suspecting their Cherokee connections. And yet, these names appear throughout the Cherokee Rolls in significant numbers, carried by families who had adopted English surnames during the long process of cultural contact and assimilation, families who were entirely and completely Cherokee in their identity and community, even as they bore names that sounded indistinguishable from any Appalachian farming family. This is one of the reasons that Cherokee ancestry is so frequently misunderstood, so often dismissed, and so commonly lost. Because Cherokee people with surnames like Smith or Rogers or Fields look, on paper, exactly like everyone else. Their story is invisible unless you know where to look. Walking Stick is a name whose Cherokee origin is entirely transparent, a direct translation of the Cherokee word Adolanves Di, carried into English when surnames became mandatory and preserved through generations as a marker of identity that no amount of assimilation could erase. Starr is a name tied to the Starr family, one of the most turbulent dynasties in Cherokee outlaw history, a family whose members crossed lines between law and lawlessness in Indian territory in ways that became legendary. Foreman, Harlan, Duncan, Mays, each name a thread in the same extraordinary tapestry, each one tied to communities, clans, councils, and ceremonies that stretch back centuries before the Dawes Commission ever arrived with its ledgers and its agenda. But here's where the story takes its most modern and most urgent turn. Because the question of who is and is not Cherokee is not just a genealogical curiosity. It is a live political and legal issue right now. The Cherokee Nation today controls significant resources: businesses, healthcare systems, educational programs, government contracts, land holdings. Tribal citizenship is not symbolic, it is consequential. And the Dawes Rolls, those ledgers compiled by a commission whose explicit purpose was to dissolve tribal sovereignty, are still the only legally recognized gateway to that citizenship. The Cherokee Nation requires an applicant to trace direct lineal descent from a person listed on the Dawes Rolls with a blood quantum, not DNA, not oral history, not community membership, a name, a number, a card. According to informed sources in genealogical and tribal research communities, there is a massive and largely unquantified population of Americans who have genuine Cherokee ancestry, real, historically documentable connections to the Cherokee Nation, but whose ancestors were excluded from the Dawes Rolls through the political and bureaucratic pressures of the enrollment period. These people cannot access tribal citizenship under current law. Their family stories, however accurate, carry no legal weight without that documentary connection. And simultaneously, there is an equally significant population of Americans who claim a Cherokee ancestry based on family mythology, the classic story of the Cherokee princess grandmother, without any historical basis whatsoever. Research suggests that claimed Cherokee ancestry is one of the most common forms of misattributed Native American identity in the United States, driven partly by romance, partly by the desire to belong to a story larger than one's own, and in some cases by attempts to access resources intended for tribal citizens. What most people are not seeing is this: the surname on your birth certificate might be more significant than you realize. Not because a name alone proves anything, but because a name is where the search begins. If your family carries one of the surnames that appears on the Cherokee Rolls, Ross, Van, Adair, Ward, Sixkiller, Boudinot, Ridge, Watty, Bushyhead, Walking Stick, Starr, Foreman, Fields, Rogers, Smith, Duncan, or any of dozens more, that name is a possible thread. It is a starting point for a search that can be conducted through official channels, through the National Archives, through the Oklahoma Historical Society's Dawes Roll database, through the Cherokee Nation's own enrollment research resources, and through organizations like the Oklahoma Historical Society and the Family Search Genealogical Database, which houses the complete digitized record of the Dawes Rolls alongside dozens of earlier Cherokee census records going back to 1835. The real story is that the Dawes Rolls are simultaneously a record of survival and an instrument of dispossession. They preserve names that might otherwise have been lost to history. They created a chain of documentary evidence that connects living people to an ancient nation, and they did all of this while simultaneously serving as the mechanism through which tribal lands were broken up, sovereignty was undermined, and a community-based way of life was replaced by individual land ownership designed to make tribal resources accessible to non-native interests. The commission that created the rolls was not acting in good faith on behalf of the Cherokee people. It was acting on behalf of the United States government, the railroad companies, and the land speculators who wanted what the Cherokee had. And the rolls it produced carry that original contradiction within every page. The three federally recognized Cherokee tribes, the Cherokee Nation of Oklahoma, the Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians in North Carolina, and the United Kituwa Band of Cherokee Indians in Oklahoma, each maintain their own distinct enrollment requirements, their own histories, and their own relationships to the documentary record. The Eastern Band, which traces its roots to those Cherokee who hid in the mountains of North Carolina and evaded removal entirely, uses the 1924 Baker Roll as its foundational document rather than the Dawes Rolls. The Eastern Band requires a minimum blood quantum of 1/16. The Kituwa Band requires 1/4. The Cherokee Nation of Oklahoma requires no specific blood quantum at all, only the documentary link to a Dawes enrollee. 3 tribes, 3 sets of rules, 3 different gatekeeping systems, each of them tracing back to the same original nation that once stretched across the entire American Southeast. And here's the thing that will stay with you long after this script ends. The Cherokee Nation has surpassed 450,000 enrolled citizens. The Cherokee Nation has around 450,000 citizens today. 25 times the number who survived the Trail of Tears. 25 times. That number is not just a statistic. It is a repudiation of everything the Removal Act was meant to accomplish. The settlers who coveted Cherokee land in 1838 believed they were watching the final chapter of a civilization. They were wrong. The bureaucrats who designed the Dawes Rolls believed they were managing the orderly dissolution of tribal existence in Indian territory. They were wrong too. The names that appear in those ledgers did not fade away. They multiplied. But what happens now to the hundreds of thousands of Americans who carry those names without knowing what they mean? What happens to the families who have passed down stories for generations? Stories of Cherokee grandmothers and great-grandparents, stories dismissed or half-remembered or told only in whispers, and who now find themselves standing at the edge of a historical record that may or may not include them. What happens when a surname that appears on the Dawes Rolls leads a researcher back through birth certificates and marriage records and census documents to find an ancestor who was right there in Indian Territory, in the right time period, living within Cherokee communities, but whose name simply does not appear on a specific government list because of the chaos and political calculation of a commission that operated over a century ago? The answer is that there is no easy resolution. The Dawes Rolls are what they are. They are imperfect. They are historically compromised. They were created under duress by a government with conflicting interests. And yet they are the law. They are the gate. They are the only document that the Cherokee Nation, the United States federal government, and the Bureau of Indian Affairs recognize as the definitive record of who belongs to the Cherokee people in a legal, documentable sense. What that means for you, if your surname appears somewhere in this story, is that the question is not whether you feel Cherokee, or whether your family always believed they were Cherokee, or whether your DNA test from a consumer ancestry company suggests Native American ancestry somewhere in your genome. Those things are real, but they are not the gate. The gate is a name, a number, a ledger entry made between 1898 and 1914 by a commission that was trying to close one chapter of Cherokee history and ended up instead creating the document that holds that history open to this day. If your surname is Ross, or Van, or Ward, or Sixkiller, or Boudinot, or Adair, or Ridge, or Waddy, or Bushyhead, or Walking Stick, or Smith, or Rogers, or Fields, or Starr, or Foreman, or Duncan, or any of the hundreds of other names embedded in those rolls, that surname is not just a name, it is a question. A very specific, historically loaded, legally consequential question. And the only way to answer it is to go looking. The Dawes Rolls are publicly accessible. The National Archives holds them. The Oklahoma Historical Society has digitized them. Family Search has indexed them. The Cherokee Nation's own registration department can guide you through the process of tracing a connection if one exists. And the Baker Roll for the Eastern Band, the Kituwa base rolls, the earlier Cherokee census records going back to the Henderson Roll of 1835, the Guion Miller Roll of 1906, All of these records exist, all of them are accessible, and all of them represent pieces of a puzzle that, for many Americans, has never been properly assembled. Because the real question, the one that sits underneath all of the history and all of the legal complexity and all of the bureaucratic records, is not whether your surname appears on a list. The real question is whether you're willing to follow the thread wherever it leads, whether you're willing to sit with the discomfort of a history that is not simple or heroic or clean, whether you're willing to understand that Cherokee identity is not a romantic story about a princess grandmother, and it is not a DNA percentage, and it is not a claim you can make because your great aunt always said so. It is a documented, living, legally recognized connection to a nation that survived removal, survived the Dawes era, survived the dissolution of Indian Territory and the creation of Oklahoma statehood in 1907, survived the termination policies of the mid-20th century, survived every single thing the United States government did to end it, and is still here, still enrolled, still sovereign, still growing. The names on the Cherokee Rolls are not relics, they are roots. And somewhere in the genealogical record of this country, those roots are still alive, still traceable, still waiting to be found by the people who carry them forward without knowing it. The question is whether your surname is one of them. And if it is, what you are willing to do about it. That question does not have a neat answer. It never did. And perhaps that is exactly the point.